Okay, ready?
3, 2, 1.
Hello and welcome back to Still We Persist. My name is Sienna. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the I Women of Color Leadership Liaison.
And hello everyone, my name is Tamara Lash. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the I Women of Color Graduate Assistant. As we do with every episode, we're going to start today off with the land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and vitality to generations from around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy to making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will, some were drawn to leave their distant homes in hope of a better life, and some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical to building mutual respect and connection across all barriers of heritage and difference. We begin this effort to acknowledge what has been buried by honoring the truth. What we now call Corvallis, Oregon, is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Ampinefu Band of Kalapuya. Today, living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today.
Thanks, Tamara.
Yeah.
So this is episode 12, and we have one of my favorite people ever, Sahana Prasad.
Hello.
Oh
my God.
We need like a
live audience
button.
and a clap in the background.
Like confetti.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Oh my God, I would love that.
That's next time.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Put it in the
just
budget.
introduce yourself.
Thank you all so much for having me. It is a pleasure to be here. As Sienna mentioned, my name is Sahana Prasad. I am the Interpersonal Violence Services Coordinator at CAPS, which is a long-winded way of saying that I provide trauma therapy services and I coordinate other services for survivors on OSU's campus.
Awesome.
Oh, and my pronouns are she and her.
Beautiful. Thank you. So we're going to hop into this conversation, starting deep. So we hope you're ready.
I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Tell us a little bit about how you integrate your personal identities to the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I am a trauma therapist, and I come to the work, I think, with a perspective that it's really impossible to do, I think, any kind of sort of clinical therapy work, but particularly trauma work, without a really acute consideration of people's identities and their experiences living in those identities, right? I think oftentimes when we think of trauma, our traditional conceptions of what trauma means feel really isolated to interpersonal things. And I think for me, as a woman of color, as somebody for whom it's taken some time to like develop and fully understand that identity, particularly like as a South Asian person, as a second-gen immigrant, as a South Asian second-gen immigrant who comes from a financially stable family, like all of those things really inform my perspective on my own life experiences. And so when I was thinking about how I wanted to practice as a trauma clinician, it was really important to me to also integrate an understanding of how people's lived experiences in their identities impact the way that they experience trauma, right? And so I really focus my practice of trauma therapy on folks who live at the intersections of multiple marginalized identities, because I also think it's really important for us to conceptualize marginalization as a form of trauma, right? The impact of things like intergenerational poverty and systemic oppression and legacies of slavery and colonization and displacement. All of those things impact people's ability to form relationships and access resources and get the kind of support that they need. And all of those have a really significant impact on the way that people experience their trauma, their likelihood of experiencing trauma, their ability to heal from trauma. And so I think that it's like my moral obligation as a trauma clinician to always be thinking about and engaging with the impacts of systemic oppression on people's lives, and also to think about what my own experiences and my identities bring to the work and how I show up in a therapeutic space and what perspective those experiences and my identities have offered me in the way that I practice.
Got it.
Wow.
Let me just type it all out. But yeah, okay, it's got it. Beautiful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
For sharing all of that. Something that is coming up for me is like you went to school, obviously, to do all of this.
I did.
You didn't just like pop up and be like, hey, I'm like, now I certified
I did
myself.
not like spring from the earth
Yeah.
like a fully formed therapist,
And
if only.
so were you taught to like think through this like paradigm in your courses, or did you have to go out and look for this on your own?
I think yes and no. So I don't think that traditional like social work or clinical education, well, I think social work more than other clinical disciplines does take like a systems framework. And so I think that that's partially why I was so drawn to social work. But in thinking about sort of like identity informed therapy or marginalization as trauma, it wasn't necessarily something that was like built into my curriculum. I was really fortunate my first year of grad school to have like two really amazing radical women of color professors who really encouraged me to think through that paradigm. I think that because of sort of like my priorities and my identities, I probably would have arrived there eventually, but I really think that those two professors were the catalyst for me in really like forming that as the sort of like center of my locus of practice. And I think that there's a growing sort of body of practice or literature around thinking about marginalization as trauma, thinking about doing identity-informed therapy or anti-oppressive therapy, and like integrating anti-racist work into clinical practice, which I think for a long time has just like sort of lived in the realm of like advocacy and organizing. And I think social workers in particular are thinking more about like how to, and psychologists to some degree are thinking about how to bring that more into clinical spaces. But I think that those are not always conversations that are happening in training programs, and also like conversations that I'm trying to bring into the space at CAPS. So I have the privilege of facilitating like a trauma-focused consultation group with a number of my really wonderful colleagues, and part of what I've tried to do in that group is to hold space for these conversations and for folks to really think about like what does it mean for us to be doing trauma work, and how can we do that in a way that like honors and acknowledges and integrates people's experiences. Yeah.
That's amazing.
That is amazing.
Thank you.
So I think what's coming up for me is like, how do you begin to heal from racialized trauma? I know that's a big question, but like,
it is a big question.
like how, like what are some steps, or maybe shifting your mindset? Like how do you do that?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a big question, and I like wish I had the answer for you. I wish I could just like wave my magic like anti-oppression wand and like and the reality is that I don't think that there is like one good answer, but I think like what comes up for me most often is I think that sometimes the most valuable part of my practice is just like acknowledging the validity of the pain that we experience, right? I think that like it is in white supremacy's best interest to mask the fact that we experience pain or oppression at all. And so I think even something about acknowledging the ways in which these systems impact us and holding space for the validity of our pain and the emotions that we experience, like that in and of itself can feel radical and transformative. And so that, I think also like part of that feels also for me like this opportunity to sort of like dig up a lot of the shame we feel about the way that oppressive systems impact us, right? Like I think that there's a lot of power in recognizing that we feel the way we feel because the oppressive systems want to make us feel that way, and it's not a personal weakness or a personal failure that we're struggling. It's that we live within systems that are designed to make us struggle, right? And so I think just bringing awareness to that can be really transformative. And then the other piece for me that I think about is really thinking about what it means to heal in community rather than in isolation. I think a lot of like the traditional literature around healing from trauma really focuses on the fact that, well, interpersonal trauma, right, which is the type of trauma that I mostly sort of deal with and practice around. But I think when we think about interpersonal trauma, we don't often think about the context in which it's occurring, right? Like people don't live their lives in a vacuum, right? There's that like Audre Lorde quote about not living single issue lives. And I think about that when I think about what healing looks like, right? We don't experience pain in isolation, so we can't experience healing in isolation either. And so I think part of what it looks like to heal from racial trauma or the trauma of any oppressive system is to think about, how do I heal within my community? How do I draw on the strengths of my community and the relationships that I have to fortify me in times that I need that connection? And to also recognize that there are probably people in my community that have experienced these same hurts, and can we build resilience together without assuming that we have to do this in a way that feels like independent or isolated.
Like that. And I think something that you brought up about the community is like, what happens when your entire community that you're around is just hurt from all of this pain? And then that leads to burnout, which is something that Tamara and I talked about in a previous episode. But like burnout and trauma is so interlocked, I've noticed. And so I don't know if you've like thought about that at all, or can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and I think that with this thing that you all have noticed, this insight that you have, is really valuable, right? I think that in a lot of times, like, our communities are also holding a lot of pain, and we do, like, out of necessity for survival, I think a lot of like caretaking for each other, right? Because we have to, because we love and care about each other, but also like when all of us are hurt, all of us are healing, and then all of us are doing the work of caring for one another. And so I think that like that is an inevitability of what healing looks like. And I think the way to sort of try to tackle burnout is to be proactive in boundary setting, right? I think a lot of the time we wait to take care of ourselves until we're like already completely drained, right? And I think that that's sort of a normal approach that we take to when we're like not feeling okay. But I think that if we can be proactive about not getting to a place where we're feeling so burned out, and thinking about like, what actually is my capacity to care for others right now? And do I need to take a step back and actually like pour back into my cup and recharge before I feel able to pour for somebody else? Right? And I think that oftentimes in really interdependent communities, there's sometimes a lot of guilt and shame about taking time to care for ourselves. And I think the reality is that we have to be able to do that, right? We have to be able to take time to replenish ourselves, to notice how we're feeling, to take time alone to restore ourselves, to be able to then do the work of caring for others, whether that's inside of a community or outside.
You say such fabulous things. I'm like, I can embroider all of this. I
know,
I just like, this could be where do I put that? But like you said, like something that I think is really impactful of like healing in communities, or like not healing in isolation. I'm like, I can embroider that somewhere. Or like thinking about how we need to like acknowledge our trauma, acknowledge our pain. I think it's so easy for people, and like myself included, like definitely I see myself doing this, of just pushing down the pain that I feel and trying not to acknowledge it, while actively telling other people, you should sit with how you're feeling, like do whatever. And so I'm like, ooh, okay, like where am I actually living into what I'm saying?
Yeah, I think this is something that like all of us, myself included, struggle with, right? It's really easy to offer compassion and understanding and love and care and kindness to everybody else in our lives, but it feels really challenging to turn that inward. Especially when we're talking about sort of this idea of like avoiding the things that are really painful, right? It is human nature to avoid difficult and painful emotions. We all do it. It is at some times adaptive, and at a lot of other times actively destructive, right? I think that we have to make space for what we're feeling. We have to sit with it, right? And that's really challenging. And I think that a lot of the times what I tell folks is, when it's feeling challenging for you to offer yourself love and care and kindness, can you take a moment to think about how you would respond to somebody else in your life, right? And can you do those same things for yourself, even if it feels challenging, even if it comes with guilt, even if there's this like little bit of yourself that doubts whether or not it feels worth it. The reality is that it is always worth it, and it doesn't have to come with guilt. And even if those feelings pop up, can we act from a place of knowing that we're worthy and offer ourselves the love and care and compassion that we would offer to anybody else, or that anybody else would so freely offer to us?
Mic drop.
Honestly, that's exactly what I was saying.
Just like clip off.
This one's really hard to drop, but I feel like it wouldn't have an impact. I might
Andrew would not be happy about that. Sorry, Andrew.
Well, you do really heavy work.
Yeah.
And like in the process of you saying like we need to turn it back and like focus on ourselves, I think about how do you care for yourselves at the end of the day, and like how are you still coming back each day and doing this?
I think that part of it for me is that I try to set really proactive boundaries. One of the best lessons I learned in my graduate education, I had the most wonderful clinical supervisor during my second year graduate internship who told me that the most important thing for me to learn was how to set healthy, proactive boundaries. Like I one time answered an email at 6 p.m. and she came into my office the next day and she said, "Thank you so much for your prompt response to my email, and also don't ever do that again." Right? Like really wanting to instill in me this idea that it is so important for me to set healthy boundaries around my work life, and I really try to do that. And it is challenging, I think, and I think proactive boundary setting is challenging for all of us because we care so much about our work, right? We want to extend ourselves because we care about the people that we're working with. And I think, and this is something that also I have had a lot of really lovely, thoughtful, insightful conversations with Jane Waite about this as well, this idea that like we cannot set ourselves on fire to keep other people warm. We can't do it. And so I think for me, part of my self-care is that proactive boundary setting and recognizing that I am a person with a limited capacity, and to be able to do my best work, I have to acknowledge that and take time for myself. And I think the other part of that is that I try to stay as close to my people as I can. I am far away from my community. Most of my folks are back in the Midwest, but I make time for them, right? Like I call my mom like 3 or 4 times a week. Like I FaceTime my best friend from grad school in Chicago 2 or 3 times a week. Like I know who in my life can hold space for my stuff, and I give myself permission to let them hold it for me when I don't have the room.
I love that.
That is really, I feel like everything you're saying, I'm just like, yep. And like, taking mental note. I think something that's coming up for me too is that like I'm so involved with organizing on campus that in the university just waits you out. And so how do you set up boundaries to like take care of yourself? That takes up a lot of time when you don't have much time to work with.
And I think that
So that's what's really hard for me, because I'm like, I need to do all of this in 4 years before I graduate. You know, I don't need to. I know I don't need to.
And I think that's the answer, right? Is acknowledging that, like, and I think this is really challenging. I think, again, like, part of white supremacy culture is this, like, sense of urgency that it instills in us. Like, everything has to be done now. And I think that that's real, because also, like, the pain that we experience is happening in the present moment. And so we feel like we need to do everything we can to alleviate that pain and the systems that are causing us that pain in the present moment. But I think that, I don't know, what came up for me when you were talking about that, about like what can you do, is I think like build enough trust with others in your community that you feel like you can let the work go and feel confident that someone else can carry it forward, right? Which is a thing that I struggle with all the time, every day, right? It is hard. It's not an easy thing to do, I think, to like release this really tight grip that we have on the work that we do and the things that we care about. And I think like building a sustainable movement, whatever movement means, whether it's organizing, whether it's therapy, whether it's in education, like building sustainable, radical work requires us to be interdependent and to trust our people, which is a long process, right? And not an easy thing to do, and not something that ever ends, but I think something that I'm still learning how to do. But I think is the only way to carry this work forward, is to trust that other people are there to do it with us.
Again, another one.
Just a constant mic drop.
Y'all are too kind.
Oh my gosh. No, but it's just so true. And I mean, I echo, like, I feel that same way of like being nervous of what's going to happen next, and like who do I feel comfortable like handing off whatever it is, as I like come to my time closing here at Oregon State for good. I'm not coming back. Bye. This is the end. But
Bye.
like that is really difficult, and so trying to set up people for success and like what in the ways that success looks like for them.
Yeah, and I think that I think that's also to our benefit, because again, this conversation that I had the privilege of having with Jane, you know, she really like brought it to into my consciousness, this idea of like this feeling that we have of like, if I don't do it, nobody else is gonna do it, is part of the way that oppressive systems like continue to be able to function, right? Like sick systems benefit from us not recognizing that they're sick, and if we feed into that by sort of at times like exploiting our own labor so that they can remain functional, right? And as challenging as it is to step away from that, again, because we care so deeply about the work that we're doing, there is also something radical in stepping away and saying like, somebody else can take this up, and if they can't because it's too much, then the system is going to fall apart, and maybe that's what needs to happen, right? And recognizing that maybe that leaves room for us to build something better, but also that like, again, we can't sacrifice ourselves in the process, because then nothing's ever going to get done, and it's not worth it. We're too important for that.
Thank you. One more time for one time. Yeah.
Wow. I'm just really digesting everything, and it's so true. I feel like I just got slapped in the face with knowledge.
Oh no.
Which is like good. It's good. No, it feels good. Like I needed it.
It was a good one.
But I think like, what is something that you love about your job?
Oh man, I love getting to work with students. Y'all really make my job amazing. I really I value the ability to like see people transform their own lives, like whether that's in a clinical or therapeutic setting, and being able to hold space for folks to do that and think about like reorganizing their lives around their values instead of feeling like their life has to be organized around their trauma, and like watching people's lives expand when they feel able to do that. That is really amazing. And also like being able to do work outside of a clinical space. I think that's something that I really value about particularly this position, and particularly being on a college campus, is like, yes, I love being a trauma therapist, and I love being able to engage with students in spaces that are non-clinical, and to be able to like be an advocate and a mentor and a sounding board, and to like do really cool programming work with all of y'all. Like that really fills me and like makes me feel like this work is meaningful and sustainable, and I just appreciate all of you so much. You're amazing. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. My heart.
Behind now.
Yeah. It's like, and that's that. Close curtains. No. Thank you.
I know that we wouldn't be able to do it if we didn't have badass faculty behind us. It's honestly true. Like, I think about all the times where I wanted to start this support group, and I was like, I don't know who to work with on this, because I don't know any women of color.
And it's like, it's amazing that you say that, because I had been wanting to create a women of color survivor support group since I got to campus. And so I think like, it's just things like that, right? Like these serendipitous moments where like the things I care about are also the things that students are wanting and asking for, and the ability to like give you all what you need, or like be a vessel for you all to get your needs met, also really fills me, because I also think like I was a woman of color student at a PWI like less than 3 years ago, and so I'm constantly thinking about like what that experience was like for me, and the ways that I had to advocate for myself, and what it felt like to not have admin show up for me when I needed them to show up for me. And so I'm like really trying to like be the person that I needed when I was at a PWI, and like show up for folks that need me in that way, because y'all deserve it, and so did I.
Shout out your group, day and time.
Oh yeah. If you're interested in this Women of Color Survivor group, we meet Mondays
from 4 to 5:30 in the Talisman room at the NU.
on weeks 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10.
Yeah.
Yes, go check it out.
Yeah.
If that's a place where you'll find community.
Yeah. And
It's a like very lovely drop-in, non-structured space.
Yeah.
So whatever you feel like you're needing from the space, that is what we usually do. So
yeah. Okay. Any lasting words you want to share with us?
I just really appreciate y'all so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that all of you do. It's just like, I know that it is challenging and I know that it can feel endless, and I really like admire the ways that you all engage in spaces on campus and the ways that you show up like for yourselves and for others, and that like makes my work feel like meaningful and possible. So thanks for like being enduringly amazing.
Thank you for being here, sharing space with us, and like just being so kind and uplifting.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Awesome. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.